Good evening, everyone. My name is Debanshu. I'm one of the co-founders of the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. Thank you so much for joining us. We are an independent think tank, primarily based out of New Delhi, but we also have offices in Bangalore, and we have recently started an office here in Mumbai. In fact, we operate out of this co-working space. Uh, this event is actually part of a series of discussions we've been organizing in collaboration with the Rainmatter Foundation on law and policy issues relating to the environment. The focus of today's discussion, as all of you know, is RBI's recent consultation paper on the relationship between finance and sustainable development. So without wasting much time, and just quick word about the speakers here. Mr. Bahram Vakil is the founding partner of AZB Partners, one of the most prominent law firms in India. And Mr. Mohit Shukla is the MD, Managing Director, Legal and Head of Regulatory Affairs at Barclays India. Their detailed bios are available on the web page for this event that we have specifically created. All of you can take a look at that. Before starting the discussion, we thought it might be a bit useful to get some context and have some background about why we are having this conversation. So I'll now hand it over to my colleague Jinaly, who leads our Maharashtra work, to give us some more context about this.
Hi, I think thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Jinaly. I lead Vidhi's Maharashtra office. And I'd also like to thank Bahram and Mohit for joining us today. And I think before we dive straight into the discussion, like Debanshu said, I'd just give a very brief context about this discussion paper and why we thought about the topic. So I think today's Green Mandate topic of discussion is, like Debanshu said, the RBI's discussion paper. And this matter is of increasing relevance because I think it's being globally recognized right now that climate change can be a source of financial risks. And these risks could be either physical, in the sense that, there could be a severe climate-related or environment-related event that could cause actual damage to the financial markets, impact cash flows, or impact damaged collaterals, etc. These risks could also be transitional, which is basically the risk to transition or adjust to a low carbon economy. And sometimes the risk could also be linked to liabilities, where people may actually suffer losses on account of either physical or transitional risks, and file for losses. So the idea is that there are different kinds of risks associated with climate change, and this is being increasingly recognized right now globally. And India is taking the first set of, it's taking its baby steps towards sustainable financing, which is what the terminology is. And I think in terms of India's efforts, one thing is quite clear, that especially looking at the latest Niti Aayog SDG index data, that the latest 2020-21 data indicates that we've made quite a bit of a progress, right? So the 2021 data indicates that, we perform well on 8 out of 15 SDGs. And in terms of states, the number of states who've started scoring higher, it was, I think, 10 in 2019-20, it's increased to 22 right now. So data indicates that we are doing, pretty decently on some of these sustainable development goals. On sustainable financing specifically, there have been quite a few initiatives. So I think the first such initiative has been, the Department of Economic Affairs has set up a task force on sustainable financing, which would be defining the framework for sustainable financing in India, establishing the pillars for a sustainable financing roadmap, and suggesting draft taxonomy of sustainable activities and a framework of risk assessment by the financial sector. So that's the Department of Economic Affairs. Another initiative has been by SEBI, which has been one of the early adopters of sustainability reporting for listed entities. So last year, it issued new sustainability reporting requirements to bring in greater transparency and enable market participants to identify and assess sustainability-related risks as well as opportunities. RBI, on its part, has also set up a unit, which is the Sustainable Financing Group, within its Department of Regulation, to lead regulatory initiatives in the areas of sustainable financing and climate risk. And this is the group that's coordinating with international banks, agencies, other financial regulators, as well as Government of India, to suggest strategies and develop a regulatory framework for sustainable financing. Additionally, I think RBI has also been a part of the Central Bank and Supervisors Network for Greening and Financial System, and it's also been a member of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Risks set up by the Basel Committee. So in pursuance of these initiatives, the RBI has now released the paper, which is the topic of discussion today. It's also conducted a survey amongst private banks, foreign banks, public banks operating in India. The survey results have also been published on the RBI website. So these are some of the initiatives towards sustainable financing that India has made. And I think, we'd be discussing the paper and the survey in much more detail today. So I think we can then just dive straight into it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jinaly. Bahram, if I may, let me start with you. Uh, we know that a lot of people argue that people in the financial sector have this armchair concern for the environment, where they say that they really care. They also see it as a worthy philanthropic cause and also contribute a lot of money. But when it comes to leading the change, it's often seen that the perception is that someone else has to lead that change, and we can help on the side, but someone else has to lead that change. But clearly, the paper shows that now there is this opportunity to lead the change, right? And so, how do you see this interrelationship between finance and the environment, and especially your top-level views on the consultation paper?
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. And if I can ask, are most of you from the financial sector or students or mix, or what is in the room? Can, broadly speaking?
I come from an organization called People's Archive of Rural India, and we basically report about lives of people who are, who live on the margins of the society. So I work for that.
I'm a journalist. I write for Business Standard and Money Control. They usually don't carry much on climate, and I want to try and change that. So I'm here to learn.
Terrific.
I'm from the legal sector.
Okay.
I'm a public policy lawyer. I'm also a public policy lawyer.
Okay, terrific.
I'm from AZB Foundation. We have a CSR arm of HDFC.
And a good supporter of.
I'm a student from the government law.
Okay, terrific. So thanks a lot. So, if I may start with your focus, sorry, I'll just start a little general, that it's in the papers today. I saw that 1.7% of finance goes to the small farmer. And of course, as we all know, agriculture is a huge part of our economy, and the small farmer plays a huge role because we all know our farms are largely fragmented. So basically, what the article said is that 1.7% of the climate green finance going to the small marginal farmer just doesn't work. So we have to find some way of changing that, because even from a climate change perspective, if you look at who gets hit the hardest the minute there's a drought or there's a flood, it is certainly the small farmer. Now, I mean, you can also, fortunately today, there's more data, there's micro insurance, but that focus we have to bring to it. I understand the challenges also for a bank, but if I may say, microfinance has done a pretty good job, and a lot of the good MFIs have helped this sector a lot. So there are solutions, and today the MFI numbers are extremely large. We are today even larger than Bangladesh. So, and just a quick wrap on the need, which we all know, but again, the hit to global GDP is anywhere between 8 to 14%. And so that, I mean, let's take a ballpark figure of $10 trillion if you do the math. So once again, even though it is expensive and there's a large cost, especially in transition, as you said, uh, the quid pro quo is almost as obvious as, say, vaccinating the world, where the hit to GDP was so huge, and we still didn't figure out a way as a world to vaccinate huge parts of our population. So I think it's pretty standard. And therefore, the financial sector, I don't think, in fairness, let's forget about philanthropy or foundations, etc. We have to make it very, very clear that it affects Barclays. So it makes sense for them to do the due diligence and the risk assessment, etc. Because, so let's take the most obvious parts of transition. One is, of course, energy. So if you're giving, certainly Barclays is not, and HDFC is not, but those banks who are still lending to coal-fired and fossil fuel, there is a huge risk. So then you take a view whether you want to increase the risk weightage, you want to lower the tenor. I mean, you have to figure it out, and certainly you have to make those disclosures, and then you'll be high risk and the reporting requirements, etc. But that is in your interest, because you can take a view of how long this is all too ambitious. It's actually going to take a longer time, but the direction is very clear. And the other one is again EVs. So again, if you're focused on an automobile manufacturer who's not getting it, who hasn't, according to you, got sufficient plans to make the transition, then again, surely you should be concerned and you should be figuring it out. So, and then the last thing I want to say on the broad spectrum is, as a country, we have so far focused very much on renewable and energy. And in many ways in the power sector, the most progress we have made in fairness is with solar. So, which is a good thing, but it's still very early days. But actually, when you look at this whole transition, it affects almost every part of the economy. So certainly it is not only energy. So it is real estate in a very meaningful way, both in terms of the building materials and then the energy saving, etc. It is certainly agriculture. Agriculture is a huge part in this. And then manufacturing, from steel to cement to aluminum to, so really it affects, our focus so far as a country has been very narrow. So once again, when you're looking at, I mean, the real expert is sitting to my right, but when you're looking at it with a banker's eyes, you're really going to figure out that there are very few areas where you can say, oh, this is not it's a zero risk. It's going to be high risk or low risk. So therefore, as financial institutions, as a regulated entity, as RBI or any regulator worldwide, I think you have to be practical. You have to, as you say, come up with rules. The taxonomy ideally should be standardized internationally. I think that would be really helpful. I was very privileged to be on a international task force on scaling of voluntary carbon credit markets. So there again, it is cross-border. I mean, Amazon may like to do part of its credits in India, etc. So if you have international taxonomy across the board, which also, as you mentioned, there are studies going on, and I know NIIF was also working on this. So country-wise and internationally, if we get that right, I think it would help a lot. And then there should be a roadmap. Again, as we were discussing, you can't go straight to, the toughest part immediately. So I have a very clear roadmap. Interested to hear what Mohit and the audience feel about. SEBI has taken some steps. So interesting to see that. And then today it's an international world. So EU seems to be on the forefront. And maybe that's the way we should go, because I think the US also is slightly slower to the game than the EU and UK. So that would be my opening comments, that there's really no choice.
Understood. So clearly, so it's no longer an external issue. The risks are really real and they're real for your business. And you also have an opportunity because, as Bahram mentioned, that green lending is a new area altogether, and you know, you might see it as a huge opportunity for the sector. Um, but as a foreign bank, you not just Barclays, but a lot of foreign banks in India seem to be ahead of the curve because of your international compliances, perhaps. And I understand, when I was looking at the survey that Jinaly just mentioned, a lot of foreign banks are already, doing a lot of things that the RBI is expecting the Indian banks to do. So, but I just wanted to understand from you as to where does your bank and, in your assessment, the banking sector stand uh, on this interrelationship, and also your initial comments on the discussion paper.
Sure, thank you. As Bahram said, this is obviously an area that is gaining attention, gaining importance, and it's been a mixed bag in terms of who's been, at the forefront, who's catching up, because obviously for different people and for different economies and different governments, different countries, obviously the curve is different. And therefore, what's important in a particular situation, in a particular context, what needs precedence, what needs priority, what you're juggling with, it's going to be a journey of evolution for everybody. And there will be catch up. Some people will definitely be ahead of the curve. And the Western economies have definitely demonstrated, a far quicker evolution towards a framework, towards addressing it, articulating what it means. Whereas for developing economies, given priorities conflicting with one another and what you need to do at a particular given point of time with scarcer resources, you're looking at things differently. And certainly for economies like ours, we also, asking the world to pay attention to the fact that there is catch up to do. And therefore, there is also a contribution to be made in terms of helping us, cross that bridge, right? I mean, from a global economy perspective, there are estimates that this whole transition is going to cost, a lot of money, possibly $3 to $5 trillion for the next 30 years, every year, right? So that is a lot of money. And therefore, where do you stand, particularly when you're transitioning from traditional sources of energy, for one, as an example, towards renewables and cleaner energy? It takes time. You can't sort of you have to look at energy poverty, energy scarcity, everything, right? Because all of that is accretive to economic growth. So, from a financial sector perspective, it becomes important when you're contributing to what is sustainable. Also, to be very careful about how you transition, right? There are immediate risks that the RBI paper also articulates in terms of what it means to continue as is, what it means, what you have to be careful about when you transition, what are the risks that associate with what you yourself have as your physical locations, etc., in the context of what is changing in the world. What is it that you'll have to be careful about in terms of collateral and security that you take, right, from clients, what it means in terms of reputational risks, what it means from claims. So it is a state of flux. There's no constant here. You're going to have to deal with it as it comes up. In that context, if you look at foreign banks, certainly, to your point, they have articulated all of this in a fairly, well thought through manner. They recognize the fact that there are stakeholders that span the entire gamut of society: shareholders, employees, clients, everybody, right, is a stakeholder in this game, and therefore you play a crucial part as a financial institution in terms of balancing all of these and making sure that you're doing the right thing, right? So that articulation is important because that articulation helps understand. So this paper also is a very important step for us to have taken as a country in terms of articulating what the ask is from the financial sector. And therefore, certainly from a foreign bank perspective, you could say that we do have a lot to rely on and fall back on in terms of how you frame all of that. And we can certainly, help with that as well as we go in terms of also being able to apply and support with global taxonomies, which is very important as we put in place what is important for the Indian financial sector as well. So,
Understood. So overall, a huge task, but achievable.
achievable and important to do. And in many ways, this is also very evolutionary, right? There is no one stop and go. A lot of this has been happening in terms of focus because as industry changes, as industry responds to new demands, and as industry responds to these challenges for itself, and you look at what SEBI has put in place for listed companies, that's a demand that the industry itself has to meet. So when industry has to meet that and start thinking about what they have to do in terms of what their obligations are, in the context of greenwashing, avoiding that, in the context of reporting what they do and what they're thinking through in terms of all of the facets of the, the national guidelines, in many ways, they've been asked to think about this already. And if they're thinking about it and then changing the way they need to do business, and then they need finance, you've already had one part of it addressed in terms of who's coming to you with what. And then if you look at that in terms of who are you lending to, what are they doing, what are they achieving, for the financial sector also that becomes very important in terms of what is it that you then are accretive to. Right?
Understood. So staying with you, Mohit, I just wanted to understand that, obviously RBI is specifically talking about climate risk, and a lot of people are saying that, this is the first time someone is talking about climate risk, for the banking sector. But the fact of the matter is that as far as physical risks are concerned, this is not a new issue at all, right?
No.
So you do look at some of these risks as part of your
Yes.
regular due diligence.
Yes.
So could you please explain as to, what could these risks be, and what are these risks that the RBI is talking about, and what mitigation strategies do banks typically take to address them?
Physical risks in the context of climate risk has been articulated, it's been discussed, right? And it's been, for the purposes of this discussion paper, it's been included by RBI very thoughtfully as well in terms of what banks should be aware of from the perspective of climate risk itself. Because otherwise, you think of physical risks in the context of business continuity in terms of disaster recovery, in terms of making sure that your services are not impacted in a way that it disrupts economic activity, right? So when you talk about physical risks not associated with climate risk in the context of this paper, for one, you're talking about the fact that you need to sort of make sure that your systems, your offices are built in such a way, placed in places where there is safety, there's reliability, there's assurance, that if a disaster were to strike you, you'd be relatively safe in the context of what it means in terms of not only employee safety, customer safety, but assets. Your assets are protected so that you can, you're not completely derailed if a disaster were to strike. So building standards, for example, is important. Where you located, a lot of thought goes into that also in terms of what kind of a location is it from a geographical perspective, from seismic risk perspective, from flooding, all of that. When your systems are set up, what are your fallbacks? Do you have systems built such as so that if a particular site were to fail, you have backup, which then kicks in to make sure that you're not disrupted and you don't stall, right? So that calls for geographical dispersion, that calls for safety standards, that calls for a lot of assessment of where you are and what are the natural risks that you're exposed to. But from a climate risk perspective, I think it calls for more attention from the perspective of the changing nature of the risk in terms of climate risk, because climate risk is now exposing you to very strong disruptive possibilities, right? From storms, from floods, from all kinds of things that are associated with climate change. And it's calling into focus the fact that you need to now sort of go back and check from this perspective as well, whether you need to do something more.
Understood. So, where I'm staying with that same point, now environmental due diligence, has been, part of financing transactions for a long time. Again, it's not a new thing at all. But how is this likely to change given the current discourse that we are seeing? Like currently, it's largely, if I understand this correctly, from a regulatory standpoint. But how are these diligences likely to change? And do you think we have the ecosystem in India to support the kind of diligence that RBI is now expecting banks to carry out?
Yeah, so I mean, you know due diligence much better than me, fortunately. But you are dead right. So when you said environment due diligence to certainly a lawyer, it was totally statutory and regulatory. Yeah. So this is a whole different ball game. As Mohit just pointed out, there's lots of stuff to look at besides just that. And again, to your point, and I think the paper, RBI paper lays this out very well and talks about, the 3-layer protection and that this must come from the top. So you have to have management buy-in, you have to have board buy-in, you have risk committee, internal audit. So all those layers have been put in. So today, I guess, even in the legal DD, we would check that all these layers and levels of protection are in there. And then the, perfect point you made about capacity and skills. So that again has been fleshed out in the paper, as you know. So it has to be built up. But from the, IBC, my favorite topic I have to bring in is that we didn't have a single insolvency professional. And we were all very worried that where will this new breed of professionals come from? And in 3 years, we had more professionals than the UK. Of course, our population is slightly larger. But so it will come. And then also, again, from the international players, from consultants who are international, they will bring in the necessary expertise. And I'm sure homegrown also will grow. So you'll have to have the trainings, you'll have to have the courses, the certifications, and build that capacity. So it will now be a much more fleshed out due diligence.
And like the insolvency professionals, a huge business opportunity for a lot of people in the future. So, Mohit, it's likely that, from the tone of the paper, it's likely that any regulations that are put in place will probably be light touch and probably expect folks to do things voluntarily, and there'll be no mandatory requirements. That's what it appears to be, at least from the tone and tenor of the paper. But if that happens, then there is this possibility of arbitrage, right? That the banks who choose not to comply or possibly don't have the capacity to comply, they will not also have to incur that cost. And then it's possible that a lot of borrowers will then go to, because they'll have lesser disclosure requirements, lesser compliances on this front. So you might also lose business if you choose to comply with a regime like this. So therefore, what is the importance of a level playing field? And because if it was mandatory, everyone has to comply, then it makes sense. But the moment you make it optional, then there are these complications that will arise. So any thoughts on that?
My sense is that there will be an expectation to make sure that you do absolutely what you have to do. Now, to a degree, from a regulatory perspective, it may be recognized that different banks are at different levels in terms of what it takes or what it may take for them to do. But I think the expectation will be that banks should do, all financial institutions should do what is necessary. So given the importance and significance of what this means and the timelines that the whole world is talking about in terms of the 1.5, and the net zero ambitions that most global institutions and governments have talked to, it's unlikely that the regulator will leave it for banks to do what they want to do, because then it frustrates the whole objective of a very important endeavor. Because this is something that is very, very top of mind in terms of the 1.5 and say 2050 as an example, and what happens in 2030, and what are you doing, in a graded manner towards achieving that as you look at various sectors, power, steel, energy, coal, whatever you're looking at in terms of what it means as the big pieces. But then together with that, the whole approach to managing this and making sure there's no catastrophe, there will be focus, there will be scrutiny in terms of what banks are doing, what they're able to achieve, and there will be a determined effort from the regulatory lens to make sure that banks are doing everything they can. Which is some of the things that the discussion paper describes also in terms of encouraging banks to go out and seek, domain expert support, training. IFC, for example, has been mentioned as a potential touch point, is actually asking banks to go and do what they have to do. So when it comes to an assessment, maybe a year down the line in terms of what have you achieved, if they have not actually floated a regulatory framework by then, they will come back to check in terms of what have you achieved, and then hold you to what you have not done. It's not going to be possible for banks to walk away from it saying, I'm not going to do it. The other question is that, yes, if you're dealing with an economy in transition, then the leeway to be able to transition it without causing disruption is going to be a factor.
Understood. So this might go the CSR way, where it started with comply or explain. A lot of people didn't comply nor explain, and then eventually it became mandatory. So so it's heartening to know that at least some people in the industry think that this should be done by everyone, and I think eventually we might see that over a period of time, if not immediately. Let's touch upon something else in the discussion paper, which is this issue of governance you touched upon, Bahram. Now, there is this recommendation that boards should consider setting up specific committees, subcommittees, to look at this issue specifically. So, in addition to your role as an advisor to a lot of bank boards, you're an independent director on certain boards yourself. So, how do you see this recommendation playing out, and what is the impact potential of a move like this?
Yeah, so, sorry if I may, I'll just also touch upon the earlier question.
Sure.
You read my mind. I think definitely it's going to go the CSR way. So the CSR, as you mentioned, it was not mandatory, but you had to give written explanation, which in itself should be a pretty clear sign, because how many companies are going to give a valid explanation to MCA that why they couldn't do it? And as Mohit will confirm with the RBI, if they just frown, the RE gets the message. So and we don't have the luxury of time. Let's face it. I mean, however tough it is, so you definitely need a roadmap, a reasonable, practical sense of timing. But again, I keep caveating. I'm not an expert, but what the experts say, sadly, because we have done so poorly over the last few decades, today only someone like Trump is going to say, I'm not a believer. So if 2030 is a kind of tipping point, after which we will be rationed in, every day-to-day life, so the amount of fuel you consume, the amount of, cars, flights that you can take, the amount of water you can do on a daily basis, we still don't believe it, because we say, oh, that's 8 years away. But 8 years is actually like 8 months. So how much time then can you give the banks, now there are large banks, there are international banks, so the smaller ones definitely that cost is important. So therefore I'm saying the glide path. But for example, again, if you listen to SEBI chairman, she is very clear that you all come up with all these stories of how it's so tough, but with technology, all this is doable. So why can't you file your accounts in the right time? And with the clients of the bank, most of the clients anyway either are self-imposing, like say a Tata Group, etc., or if you're international, then anyway you don't have a choice. So I think it's going to be mandatory sooner than later. Coming to your point, I mean, say, so take me as an independent director, how much expertise do I have? So therefore, you definitely need that committee. So that, as I said, at all levels, you need to build that up, and therefore the board takes it very seriously. And you bring on in the committees that whatever expertise based on geography, as we've discussed, there are certain geographic areas which are much tougher. There are certain activities, as we all know, which are much more prone to this. So, whatever the need be, you bring that in, but the governance needs to be top down and in spirit, not a tick the box exercise, because otherwise you'll be in trouble sooner than later. And just one last thought on this whole thing is that from a banker's perspective, that let's again go back to IBC and the history, is that there were so many power sector guys, right? Who all those out of the top 12, even now. So there can actually be systemic risk also. If you keep lending to the mining boys and oil and gas and coal, etc., then at some point SBI will be in trouble, and then it's not going to be funny.
Especially if that 2050 or 2070 target is true, because eventually if you have to become net zero, then all of them either have to close or become bankrupt. Uh, so Mohit, staying with the governance point, like there are some expectations from the senior management also. Like you also talked about training, but how easy or difficult is it going to be for the entire banking sector? And I hope you read between the lines there. Like senior management across the board for the entire banking sector needs to be sensitized to these issues.
It shouldn't really be. I mean, if you look at it for what it is, it really shouldn't be, because it is systemic and it is human, right? So just to go back to the point of committee, you will, as Bahram said, you will need a committee, and that has to be constituted with experts. And those experts have to be basically people who can help the institution look at the entire issue holistically, right? Because this is not one aspect, it's not one strand, it's not one thread. This is an issue that impacts us in many, many ways. So from a committee perspective, in terms of oversight, in terms of direction, it has to be very, very holistic in terms of what it means, right? Because it has to weigh in on a number of issues associated with whatever you may be involved with as a financial institution. That's your guiding path, right? Senior management, then obviously, just as we've been enjoined rightfully to do a number of things in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of other technology issues, in terms of data privacy, in terms of risks associated with various facets of how we function as institutions. We've been enjoined to do a lot, right, across these areas, and we've been offered support in terms of training. This is going to be no different in that context, right? It means that you have to be familiar with all of what this is. It's difficult. The subject is not easy because it has so many strands to it, right? And getting a sense and an appropriate hang of everything that is associated with this, all of the discussion that has gone on, SDG, the national guidelines, for example, globally, all of the other guiding principles. You have to be aware of all that, but it's not an impossible. I mean, this is something you can do. So I don't think there's an excuse for anybody in a bank to say that this is just too difficult. If somebody has to come and tell me what it is about, and I have to be familiar with it and then start applying it. It's like many of the things that we've all had to do over the years.
Yeah, so I think technology is a great analogy. I mean, it's super complicated, it's very fast moving. So it would, but you need the expertise and
That's
you
right.
need to bring in the experts. But also, not such a fair question to tell a banker as a lawyer, I can be more frank. The public sector banks are too big a part of you know that. So, I know it's shrinking, but even now it's what, about 60% of the financial assets?
It's a very dominant sector.
So it's huge, and then you know that SBI is roughly half of that.
Very big. Yes.
So start with that, and they certainly have the capability. And then take, even if you take the top 4 or 5, and then be more reasonable with the ones that need a little more time. But you can't exclude the top 4 or 5. There's no question.
Absolutely. So it's heartening to know again that this can be done and done across the sector, because that's critical for this to work effectively. Now let's move on to disclosures. The discussion paper talks a lot about disclosures and the kind of information that needs to be put out. But it appears to be quite complicated. So before I come to you, Mohit, if I may request Bahram to just help us understand, what are the kind of disclosures the RBI is possibly looking at from banks, and what purpose are these disclosures likely to serve?
From my reading of it, it's there they have gone international, right? So they said, why don't we just look at the what has come up from FSB and use the TCFB, right?
TCF, yes.
So now, I mean, you can say that again, that's pretty onerous. I think off the top of my head, there were 11 levels of disclosure. Again, have a glide path, give the larger ones, can start first, and then give the smaller ones a little more time. But we've all agreed that having international standards and uniform standards would be helpful. So that's the way RBI has gone. I mean, it would be great to hear the bank's feedback, and if you feel there's a different way to go.
Yeah, and connected to that, Mohit, is the assumption that for the bank to be able to disclose a lot of this information, you should be able to get this information from your borrowers. So is that also something that we should be concerned about? And do you think we have the ecosystem where all these borrowers, especially say small businesses, will have the systems in place to give you that information for you to be then talking to others about the details?
It's a glide path. It is evolution. It is evolutionary, because I think we all would agree that for everybody to grapple with this, they will all have to take their own journeys. I think the focal point for everybody is that this is urgent and that this has to be addressed. Then comes the how, and then you start looking at the fact that you have to do it, and this is how you have to do it. So stepping away from the concern that I can't do this is going to be an important aspect. And I think, therefore, from a regulatory framework perspective, what SEBI has done, for example, is important. Of course, smaller companies are outside the ambit of that if they're not listed. But then it's for the financial sector to start looking at that with the same lens, to say proportionately, what is it that applies to the kind of small business that you're looking at, and what does it mean in terms of what is their footprint and what is their responsibility, and how do they look at these things, and therefore reputationally and from a climate risk perspective, would you want to engage with somebody who's not able to satisfy what you need to, what your obligations are?
Understood. So a tailored approach instead of a
Yes.
one size fits
No.
all type of system. So that makes a lot of sense. So Bahram, you also advise some of these potential borrowers, right? So it's very likely that they're going to make a lot of hue and cry about these disclosures. They're like, I'll rather go to some other bank instead of disclosing, my potential threat to the climate in the next 20 years. So what would you tell them?
No, so I also aware of the time, so I'll just be very quick. No, as we said that the 1,000 that SEBI has already regulated, so that's easy, and then you kind of break it up, have a glide path, also do level 1, level 2, level 3 in a sensible time frame. But if we are covering all the banks, then the borrower has to just get his act together and depending on his size have more time or less time, but he has to see that the writing on the wall is my short answer to it.
Understood.
I think the last set of questions, Behram and Mohit, are on green lending actually. And I think my first question is to Behram, which is that, the discussion paper also nudges banks to lend more to green companies. And India, as of now, has a robust ecosystem of green companies. So my question to you was slightly more general. Can you give us a brief overview of the sector and how it might benefit from this momentum around green financing?
Yeah, so very fast, because this is my wrap up, is that I'll start where, end where I started, that in green finance, which is, we are at a very nascent stage, but, so you can't have just 1.7% to the small farmer. So figure that out and make that much more meaningful. It's the big question is whether you use, and I'd love to hear everyone's views on it, the carrot and stick. So uh, people have been talking about to the RBI that do you put it as part of priority sector lending? Do you have risk weightage? So therefore, this is lower risk weightage. Of course, cost-wise also, but then you would have to have very strict metrics or result-oriented, based on which then the cost to the borrower goes down. Yeah. So how active does the central bank get on this? And I know, frankly, that even across the world, there are divergent views. I think Raghuram Rajan wrote that, central banks have their hands full. Look at the situation today. Inflation is totally out of control. For RBI, again, very quickly, you've got inflation versus growth like everywhere in the world. And you've got the rupee. And you want, jobs for us, 1 million new jobs every month. So are you going to push this on top of it all to make it even more complex? So no easy answers, but really there's no choice. So how do you take it? But again, everyone should push. And here the larger banks and the international banks should take the lead. That's my request.
And I think the last question to Mohit, something that Behram said is that financing of renewable energy projects has been a part of RBI's priority lending sector for a while. So how do banks see green lending? How do they tag their assets as green or non-green? So that was my question to you.
I think it's a focused approach in terms of the fact that it is green and therefore it is important. So as you consciously look at your portfolio selection in terms of what matters, it is something which has been a focus area for banks for quite a while already. And it's only set to grow, right? Because it is important as a sector for the fact that it introduces and grows in the economy, something which is very important for the economy, but also from the perspective of climate risk and climate change. From a financing perspective, it is definitely something very responsible also. So it is definitely something which has been an area that banks have been focusing on already and will continue to want to do.
And not just from a sustainability angle, but also as a
Yes.
commercial opportunity, right?
As banks and non-bank finance companies are commercial, so any lending will have a commercial lens to it. But at the end of the day, what's your portfolio selection? What's your segment selection? Is then what comes into play in terms of the bigger picture, right? Are you consciously, is your strategy focused on areas that matter in terms of climate risk as well? Becomes part of what your philosophy is, right?
Thank you so much. Before we open it up for questions, like, what is it that you will tell RBI? Like, what is your, if I were to ask you your top suggestion, like each of you, uh, should this be mandatory? Should this be voluntary? What is it that you would want RBI to do? Behram?
No, so as I said, I think there's really no choice. So I think it would have to be, you can do a CSR approach and start with that, you know, but sooner than later it's going to be mandatory, but make it sensible, have a roadmap, have a glide path. Uh, Unfortunately or fortunately, I think there's no choice.
I mean, taking into account the survey and RBI's own, gleanings from the survey, I'm sure that any policy that comes out of this paper will definitely factor in an approach that will accommodate the fact that different banks are at different phases. But overall, my sense is that it will be something which will be an expectation that has to be complied with.
Understood. Interestingly, the paper, although is probably created by this department on sustainable finance that they've set up, but it was put out by the Department of Regulation.
Yes.
So clearly, there are some regulations that are likely to come sooner than later. And yeah, so I think that's about it. And it would be great if if folks in the audience, if you have any questions, you would identify yourself and then ask the speakers any questions that you might have.
Energy Conservation Amendment Bill, because I understand that is where it gives some sort of powers to the executive to make these kind of regulations. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that again, starting with the uniform taxonomy, that will help, because I think that from day one we should ensure that it's not just domestic, that it can also be cross-border. And the second thing, I think we've seen, if there's a demand-supply skew, if the market doesn't work well. So we need to focus on that as well to make sure. I mean, as of now, I think in the EU, they are very focused on that, and they are working on that. So I think that would be another principle that, because the last round, I remember there was a big skew between demand and supply. So, I mean, I don't, unfortunately, I'm not clear on exactly how much momentum there is and what is the timing of this, but this would be my, two-bit view on this.
No, nothing more to add, except that I think that if you're looking at it from the financial sector lens, it will again become something that the financial sector will have to play catch up to, right, in terms of whatever is framed with respect to the executive power to draft regulation and put it in place, will again be something that for the financial sector will be again a bit of a wait and watch in terms of what does this mean for the larger commercial community, and then how do I participate? So it's hard to tell at this point of time. I think, from
and all that greenwashing and
Yes.
diligence on because they have had some bad experiences in South America, etc. So I think all that will come into play. But I hope they take all that experience, and as I said, this task force did a fantastic job. So if they interact with them, because they were helping several countries on developing legislation and markets around this. So that would be very good. But I mean, in a way, this whole greenwashing thing, and to your point about borrowers, just three examples for which all of you know, but just to highlight the backlash and why it is very important. When Debanshu asked me what about borrowers, of course, these are all huge guys, but VW, that famous emission thing where they claimed they had a defective device for monitoring and it was actually 40 times the emission that it gave out. You saw what it did to VW. I mean, it took a long, long time. Their market cap got hammered, their image got hammered. Second example is Exxon. I mean, all this is in the public domain. They said how they are green and they were, going to move away from carbon, etc. And they put solar panels on almost all their petrol pumps. And then in today's world, everyone digs up the facts. And the facts were that 96% of their spend was on oil and gas. So again, huge backlash. And the last craziest one, because actually otherwise it has a super image, is Starbucks, which said that they are getting rid of the straws, and now you'll have the cap that is strawless, and that cap, the new cap, had more plastic than the straw and cap combined. So you have to be careful. I know there are 20 other examples, but as I say, that's why in today's world you really have to be cautious, and it's not a tick the box exercise, that's for sure.
Yeah, please.
Zomato is another example. There's an article today the Ken has carried about their climate conscious delivery nonsense. But thank you for keeping the discussion accessible for someone who has not read the paper and is new to the subject. So now I'm excited to dig in and get to know more. But in terms of the question, there is a lot of conversation, at least on social media right now, about climate reparations with respect to the floods in Pakistan. I'm wondering what your thoughts are as a banker, both of you actually, and anybody on the panel. What are your thoughts on climate reparations as a concept? Do you think that works only for activism, or do you think people are taking it seriously in other sectors as well?
Yeah, they're likely to, because it is one of the risks that has been talked about as well. One is, of course, that somebody who feels aggrieved by the practices that a particular institution may adopt, and may then seek redress in terms of what those policies or practices have then created for them, definitely will have a role to play in terms of the risks that are associated with irresponsible behavior. So that is something that institutions are being asked to think about as well. That your practices and what you choose to do may also create this risk for you, because people will feel aggrieved about the outcome of your conduct, and what it means for them in terms of, and whether it's a a constituent of, say, a bank, a depositor, what they may feel about what your lending practices may have created for them in terms of risks. It may be that is potentially one sector that may have access to grievance redressal from that perspective. And otherwise, from generally, I think communities may also take issue, right, from what you've been doing in a particular community or country in terms of your practices, what you espouse, what you seek to commercially transact with, and what is the impact of the activity that engagement then generates, which may be harmful to the community. So from both perspectives, it is something that does matter as one more aspect of what climate risk brings to bear.
You want to add something, Bahram? You want to add something to that?
I totally agree. I mean, and there are class actions in other parts of the world, and uh, I don't want to scare the bankers, but you can even take it another step, as you said, besides depositors, of course, if it's a project and we all know that the leverage is high, then they can say, you were kind of aiding and abetting this disaster. So it's tough to be very careful and conscious about.
But just if I may add one thing there, to the extent there's an international dimension, like for instance, a company here doing something outside, enforceability is typically a huge issue, and especially if governments are involved, and it's largely politics and less law. Then it depends on how much power that country has essentially to get the reparations. Exactly. So, anyone else in the audience? So, if others don't like, I might just use the time to ask you one last question, if you don't mind. Now, the paper talks about regulated entities, but the survey was all about banks and what about others in the ecosystem? Like, now the banking sector has huge emerging competitors. Like fintech is so big now. So, do you think this framework is likely to apply to them as well? Or clearly, there is no indication in the paper as to whom this will apply to, like beyond banks, of course.
Yeah, I think again, step at a time. No, I mean, that for NBFCs also now they've got the scale-based regulation, etc. So, and fintechs, I mean, they're still struggling with how they should be regulated. So, I think a step at a time. I mean, I don't know what.
No, I agree.
Bharat and
It will get there because regulated entities is far broader than banks. So both non-bank finance companies are already regulated, and then once the fintech sector becomes more squarely, in the framework, they will also be covered. I think broadly, you really can't delineate financial activity by type of organization, regulated entity that has a financing activity is a regulated
Understood.
entity.
So the feeling is that everyone in the sector should essentially
Yes.
comply.
Yes.
Maybe not tomorrow, but over a period of
That's
time.
right.
So hopefully
Yes.
we'll get there. No, so thank you so much, both of you. It's been lovely having the two of you, and it's, I think, clear to everyone. And in addition to being brilliant commercial minds, you also have excellent hearts, and you really feel for the environment as well. And I hope the rest of the sector also has more and more people like you. Again, thank you all of you for joining us for this discussion. And as I said, this is our first in-person event for our Maharashtra office. So we're really happy to host all of you here. We still remember our first in-person event for our Delhi office, which is now 8-9 years old. So whether you like it or not, you're not part of our history. So, and as I said, this event is being recorded, and we might put it up on our YouTube channel. Once we do that, we'll probably send you an email. Of course, after taking consent from both our speakers. Yeah, and we've some copies of our reports lying at the back. They are free. Please feel free to take them. They're just for spreading the word here about the kind of work that we do. And as I said, Jinaly, she leads our Maharashtra work. She's based out of Bombay. And we hope to remain in touch with all of you, and of course with Bahram and Mohit. Thank you so much. It was lovely having all of you here.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much.